Welcome to our first Trade Policy Research Forum webinar of the year. And we'll be starting in just a few moments as we give people time to get into the webinar room. Good morning to everyone. Good morning, Hannah. Good morning, Ha. Good morning, Mahdi, or good evening, good afternoon to some of you.
Yes, thank you so much for getting up early, staying up late, or whatever you're doing to be here with us. You know, what I really love, Ben, is if people can go ahead and just write in the chat where they're coming in from today. That's always fun to know. So I'm in Sweden, and Ben, you're in New York. So to us, it's a pleasant time of day to be having these. And there are some people here that we know and we know well. Welcome, everybody. So I'm going to start with a short presentation of the forum, right? I'm going to start with that already, Ben, because we have such an amazing presentation today and we don't want to miss a second of it. So welcome everybody to the TPR Forum, Trade Policy Research Forum that Ben and I started 2.5 years ago. We run a monthly webinar series. Hey, Brazil! Carolina is from there. Welcome. And so we started 2.5 years ago, and we do this to bridge the gap, as our fantastic logo there is trying to show off. So we bridge the gap between policymakers and academics, and also academics in different areas. And we also bridge the gap between countries and across the world. And also, hopefully, we're looking to also bridge the gap between generations of people interested in trade policy. And if you are interested in following us, hey, Tanzania, cool, welcome. And if you're interested in being connected to us, you can sign up to our newsletter. You can join our LinkedIn group and you can follow us on Twitter, and we'll follow you right back. We have a very active and fun LinkedIn group with about 1,600 people. So it's a great place to continue the conversations after the seminars, and also post things that are that we think are of interest for the others. So if you have job openings or conferences or new papers, or if you're looking to find something out, it's a really good place to start these conversations. And I also checked with both Ha and Mahdi, and they are also on LinkedIn. So if you jump on into the group, you'll find them there. And they're all right with continuing the conversations after. The seminar today will be, as we usually do, will be recorded and posted on the website together with their presentations. So you can just kick back and relax and listen, because everything here will be available afterwards. It might take me a couple of days to wrestle my son into doing it, because Ben and I run everything by ourselves. And so that might take a few days, but it will be coming up. So what did I forget, Ben?
I think we're good. Maybe I can introduce our speakers. So we've got a great session today, and I've got to say it's one that I'm personally pretty excited about because I've done a lot of work on non-tariff measures and TBTs in the past. So I'm really looking forward to hearing this session. So the main presentation will be by my friend and colleague Ha, who'll be speaking about her paper on technical barriers to trade, product quality and trade margins, firm level evidence. Ha's an economist at the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, which is based in Jakarta. If you know the organization, you know that they do great work all through the region in terms of research and capacity building. If you don't know them, look them up. They're a great resource in Southeast Asia and a great example of Japanese development cooperation in the region. And we'll have discussion comments from Mahdi Ghodsi, who's an economist at the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies, also someone who spent a lot of time looking at non-tariff measures and technical barriers to trade. So we're looking forward to a great presentation. And without any further ado, I'll hand over to Ha for her presentation.
Oh, can I just say, Ben, that people can post their questions in the comments or in the Q&A as we go, so that we have this as a dynamic conversation. Sorry, Hai, go ahead.
Okay, so thank you very much, Ben, for the excellent introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. My name is Thi Thanh Doan from Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. I didn't know that this is the first webinar of this year. So I do hope that we find some positive or encouraging findings from these studies. I hope it will be a good start for the new year. For me personally, I'm from Vietnam, so we are still celebrating the traditional Lunar New Year. And this is also my first presentation of the new year. So I find it a very great start for the new year. I'm still in a festive mood, so please forgive me if I make any mistakes. Although Ben has advertised my organization greatly, I just would like to introduce a bit, to take the opportunity to introduce it a bit. The ERIA is a regional think tank, and for the last 5 or 7 years, we work on various topics related to economic integration and narrowing the development gap and sustainable development for ASEAN countries, together with the dialogue partners in the region. And for the last 5 to 7 years, the NTM, the non-tariff measures, have been high on the region's economic integration agenda. So the mindset has been shifted slowly from the trade concession approach, where elimination of NTMs is emphasized, to a more pragmatic approach, emphasizing harmonization and simplification of procedures. Nevertheless, when we work with various countries, we still observe a kind of concerns from the government officials regarding how to tackle NTMs, because the effects are quite ambiguous, and in certain cases they can be used as a disguised trade barriers. So our key motivation for this paper is from that observation that whether NTMs are good or bad and what evidence we have out there. So this paper is tries to answer that question partly. This paper, we do not work on ASEAN, we work on China, but we believe that the implications are relevant for other developing countries as well. This work is a joint work with my colleague, Dr. Hong Yong-jang from the Research Institute on Economy, Trade and Industry of Japan. Okay, so a bit of the background, since you are here, I guess probably you are familiar with the term non-tariff measures, but just in case, what we define here in this paper, we use the definition by UNCTAD, which is widely used in the policy discussion these days, that are the policy measures other than ordinary customs tariffs that can potentially have an economic effect on international trade in goods, either by changing quantities traded or affecting the prices, or both. So as you can see here, the concept is really broad in the sense that it covers a wide array of policy instruments with very different objectives, as well as different designs and the way they are implemented. Now, on the one hand, we see measures which have a very clear trade objective, that is to limit trade. For example, we talk a lot about export restrictions during the COVID, right? We see prohibition, we see trade remedies, particularly anti-dumping, and we see quota and or tariff rate quota. Those are the traditional commercial policy which have a very clear aim on limiting trade. But then on the other hand, we observe a very large fraction of the NTMs that are technical regulations with good purposes. They ensure consumers' rights and safety, they ensure the quality of the products, they limit the spread of harmful pests and diseases. We can name this like tolerance limit of harmful substances or the maximum residual limit. We have labeling, where all the information about the product is presented and the requirements about packaging, on storage, on transportation, on production process. Then we have a series of conformity assessment on testing, inspection, certification to ensure that the goods meet the requirements of standard. And within ASEAN, for example, the area has been working on construction and update of the ASEAN Plus NTM database together with UNCTAD, as I have mentioned. And we observe, what we observe is about 2/3 of the total NTMs fall into these categories of legitimate NTMs, which are actually, these NTMs are in the gray area where the trade policy meets the public policy goals. So these are the NTMs effects. The effects of these NTMs are ambiguous. On the one hand, they represent added trade costs for exporters, which can be in the forms of fixed costs, where the firms have to invest more in product and process innovation to acquire necessary infrastructure such as storage and for testing facilities, etc. And the NTMs can also incur variable costs. For example, when a firm exports, the firm will have to comply with administrative procedure, will have to spend time and money on obtaining some permits, will have to do an adaptation of product labeling, because in each country there can be different requirements on product labeling, or they may also have to switch to a different intermediate inputs depending on the country's regulation, among others. So these added trade costs create extra burdens for the exporters, and in certain cases they can be used as a disguised trade barrier, so they can impede trade. But on the other hand, because NTMs are there for good reasons, they serve legitimate purposes, they protect consumers' health and safety, they protect the environment, they protect national security or animal welfare, for example. So by setting requirements on products' attributes, NTMs can act as a signal of quality, and thus it can help enhance consumers' confidence in the quality of the product, through which the demand can be increased, and producer facing increasing demand will be encouraged to invest more in quality upgrading. So because of this ambiguous effect, understanding the costs and benefits of NTMs facilitates policy making, because there's always this argument, at least among ASEAN countries, that we observe whether NTMs are bad or not, and how to treat each NTM, whether we should aim at elimination, or how what would be a pragmatic approach to address NTMs to minimize the cost and at the same time to enhance the benefits. So that is the policy motivation for our study. And from the academic point of view, we also see that the majority of the literature focuses on the cost side. This is still an emerging topic. And we see that most studies are conducted at the country product level with few firm level studies. And we try to fill this gap by addressing the impact of NTMs on exporters' behavior using firm and customs level data. So the objectives of this paper, we ask whether the enforcement of technical regulations or standards in our paper, in particular, technical barriers to trade affects firms' export behavior. Now, NTMs, as I mentioned earlier, cover a plethora of measures. Okay? But here in our paper, we only focus on the TBT, which are the requirements on product characteristics, such as the technical specifications, the quality requirements, related processes and production process methods, measures such as labeling, packaging, for environment purposes related to consumer food safety and national security, etc. So we look at the 4 aspects of firms' export behavior. We look at the trade margins, so the intensive margin and the extensive margin. We also look at the export price, and most importantly in our study is the quality of exported products, where we believe our paper can make the most contribution to the literature. And we also follow the previous studies to address firm heterogeneity, to include firm heterogeneity in our analysis, because we know that different firms may react differently to trade policy. So we include several aspects of firm characteristics, such as size, ownership type, number of markets served, the initial product quality. And in this paper, we use Chinese data. China provides an interesting setting for our analysis because first, China is the biggest exporter in the world, and the spectacular rise of China has raised concerns to some policymakers in some other trade partners. And there have been quite a lot of studies which document the detrimental impact of Chinese imports on employment and growth. So we think maybe to counterbalance the loss for domestic producers and workers, policymakers may resort to trade policy instruments, and NTMs could be among them. And the second justification for using the Chinese data is that China is still a developing country, and the regulator framework may not meet developed country standards. So we may see more diverse impact of technical barriers to trade on Chinese exports. To obtain these research objectives, we utilize a rich Chinese customs data in which we match with annual survey on industrial firms. And we also use, for the TBT, we use the World Trade Organization's specific trade concerns database covering a 12-year period. We address 3 questions. First, we ask whether the enforcement of standards affect firms' entry and exit in the destination market, as well as export prices. Second, we ask if firms upgrade their product quality in response to the imposition of the TBT. And the third one, if we observe quality upgrading, then what could be the underlying mechanism? So through which channel do firms upgrade their product quality? Our key findings on entry on the trade margins, we find that the TBT is positively associated with higher probability of exit. And among the incumbent exporters who survive, they enjoy larger sales and charge higher export prices. The third key findings is that we observe quality upgrading. So firms upgrade their product quality by expanding their R&D, importing more intermediate inputs and capital goods. And we see that the positive impact of TBTs on quality upgrading offsets that on price increases, resulting in lower quality adjusted export prices. Now, if we interpret the access to better quality products at a lower quality adjusted price as an improvement in consumers' welfare, then we may say that NTMs enhances consumers' welfare in this case. So these findings have very important policy implications, we believe, because it highlights the neutrality of NTMs, which means that NTMs are not always trade restrictive. And not only about the neutrality, but also it shows the complexity of NTMs. Say they serve legitimate public policy goals, yet they can be trade restrictive. So for effective policy intervention, it's crucial to weigh both the costs and benefits. On the empirical specification first on the data. As I mentioned earlier, we use 3 data sources, which we match together. The first one is the TBT Specific Trade Concerns database by the WTO. This record all the concerns raised by WTO members at the HS4 digit level. And for this study, we only focus on the concerns raised by China. This table shows the cumulative number of TBT concerns by maintaining members. As you see here, these are the measures, the total number of concerns that were raised by China and have not been resolved at a certain point in time. For example, you see here in 2006, China raised 18 concerns against Japan, and 8 of which were resolved within 1 year, and the rest had been resolved by 2008. So if a concern was raised in the early years and stayed until the end, then the cumulative number will be large. We see also here the EU stand out among the maintaining countries, contributing to approximately 2/3 of all the concerns raised by China. Then we also see Korea and the US account for about 20% and 10% respectively. So that's the first observation. The second observation is that the TBT concerns tend to concentrate more on very few large trading partners. Now, this is also probably a shortcoming of this database because it does not cover the universe of the TBTs. It only covers the TBTs that are perceived as barriers or restrictive by the countries that raise the concern. So it doesn't mean that small export markets do not have restrictive NDMs, but the thing is to bring this issue to WTO is a costly process. And countries will be more selective about raising concerns. And intuitively, they may be more likely to raise the concerns against important export markets due to the potentially larger loss. And that's why we see that the TBT concerns concentrate on only these few large trading partners. Nevertheless, we still think that this data is suitable for our analysis because these are the very prominent TBTs that are perceived as trade restrictive by the exporters. And because of that, it's more likely to have a large or significant impact on the exporters. And later we will read the estimation results as the lower bound of the effect that we observe. Now, on the second data source, we use the Chinese customs data. Now, this database has also been extensively used in the trade literature. We aggregate the information of the firm to the firm HS4 product, destination, and year level. And we do some data cleaning to make the data set manageable technically, because it's a really huge data when we expand this to the product destination year level. Okay. The third one is the annual survey of industrial firms. This is also a very popular data set used on Chinese firm level analysis. And we match this data with the customs data using the firm name, phone number, postal code, and address. Now, the baseline specification. On the left-hand side, the WIIPDT, the Y, here we consider various outcomes of the firm's export behavior and performance. So we have on the left-hand side, the Y represent for 5 different outcomes: exit, entry, the export value, export price, and product quality. Then on the right-hand side, we have the TBT at the HS4 digit destination year and time level. So PI, PDT denote firm, HS4 digit, product, destination, country, and year, respectively. And then we also include a set of controls, including tariff, anti-dumping, and a set of fixed effects. Okay, so now let me go a bit more detailed into the outcome variables and what we expect about the impact. First, we look at the exit. We define exit as a dummy which receives the value of 1. If there's no export in year T, but exports in year T minus 1 and 0 otherwise. So as we discussed, higher fixed cost raises the cutoff productivity for firms to export. So the less productive firms are driven out of the market and resulting in trade diversion to market with more relaxing requirements. So we expect a positive estimated coefficient of TPTs on exit. The second outcome variable is the entry variable or the export participation. We set the entry equals 1 if there is no export in year T minus 1, but export in year T. The impact on entry is more ambiguous because it depends on the magnitude of the trade cost effect versus the demand enhancing effect. The third outcome is the export value. So the impact of TBT on this export value is also ambiguous because on the one hand, surviving exporters may enjoy larger market share due to the reduced competition following the exit of less efficient exporters. But on the contrary, increased variable costs would result in smaller export value. The fourth outcome is the export price, where we expect a positive relationship between TPT and export price due to the added trade cost and due to the increased market power resulting from reduced competition. And finally, we expect a positive relationship between TPT imposition and quality upgrading because the TBT can act as a quality threshold, which could help resolve the asymmetric information problem and increase the average quality of the products on the market. Then we include a set of controls, as I mentioned, tariff, anti-dumping, and a set of fixed effects. We also look at some aspects of firm heterogeneity to see if there's any differences in the impact across these firm groups. Now, let me move on to the main results. Here in table 2, I present the Beza result of the impact of TBT on firms' export behavior. We have 6 columns, exit entry, export value, export price, quality. And then we have this 6th column, which is essentially just the difference between the coefficients in the 4th and the 5th column, that is the quality adjusted price. After controlling for the tariffs and anti-dumping, we see that the coefficients on TBT is statistically significant for all the outcome variables except for the entry. Now, first on the first column, on the exit probability, we see a positive and significant coefficient here showing that the TBT act as a trade cost, pushing exporters out of the market. This is as expected as we mentioned earlier, because especially when the concerns raised to the WTO are often regarded as trade restrictive. And this result is also in line with some other studies using the same database and also the same topic. But we see the economic impact, that is the magnitude of the coefficient, is quite small. On the entry, we do not find a significant impact. So this is also in line with some studies which also show the same findings, that the impact on exit is significant, but entry is not, probably because of the mixed impact between the trade cost impact and the demand enhancing impact that we discussed earlier. Among the surviving exporters, that is the column 3, the imposition of TBT is associated with increased export sales and higher export prices. So the TBTs are associated with as much as 4.9% increase in export sales and 4.5% increase in export prices. Now, one possible source of higher prices is higher production cost, which is then passed through to customers. However, a price increase accompanied by larger export sales can imply the role of quality. So that is why we add column 5 and then further column 6 to show the impact of the TBT on the product quality. And the net welfare effect on consumers is shown through these quality adjusted prices, which is negative coefficient. So in other words, in the presence of TBTs, consumer can obtain a better quality product with the same amount of money. So that is the coefficients on the TBT. Even though tariff and anti-dumping are just controls here, I would like also to note one interesting observation that we had. Here is with the tariff. We see that the estimated coefficients of tariffs are negative for the price and the quality, but positive for the quality adjusted prices. This suggests that because tariff decreased the export price and product quality of Chinese firms, the quality adjusted price increased. This suggests that TBTs might act as a fixed cost and provide an incentive for firms to upgrade their product quality, while tariffs might act as a marginal cost to exporters, which does not have the same quality upgrading incentive. Okay, so that's for the baseline. So after this baseline, if you look at our working paper, we do a series of robustness check as well as heterogeneity of firms, but because of time limitation here, I'm going to skip that part. And if you're interested, you can find it in our working paper version on ERIA's website at eria.org. Now let me move on to the mechanism of quality upgrading, because this is something we're truly interested in. Our result shows a positive and significant impact of TBT on quality upgrading. So we continue to explore the underlying mechanism through which firms upgrade their product quality. Partly due to data availability, we only consider these 5 aspects of firm adjustment. We look at imported intermediate inputs, we look at imported capital goods, we look at investment, we look at R&D, and then final, we look at training. In the first stage, in panel B, we see whether the imposition of TBT affects these aspects, whether it affects imported intermediate inputs, whether it affects capital goods, investment, R&D, and training. And in the second stage, in panel A, we see whether these adjustment on imported intermediate inputs, capital goods, investment, R&D, and training affect the quality. Now again, we see that in the first stage, in panel B, there's a positive and statistically significant effect of TBT on imported intermediate inputs, on capital goods, on R&D, after we control for firm and industry year fixed effects. And consistent with our expectations, firms respond strongly to TBTs by raising the imported intermediate inputs, capital goods, and R&D. but we do not find a significant impact on training and investment. Now go to panel A. The outcome here is the mean product quality. What does that mean? Because products are different, we cannot compare the quality of different goods directly within a firm's production portfolio in absolute terms. So what we do is we first estimate product quality at HS a 6-digit level. Then we determine average export product quality by the average observed across all firms exporting that HS 6-digit product category. And our estimation result shows that the mean product quality increases as a result of an increase in imported intermediate inputs, capital goods, R&D. Okay. So these are the key observations of our study. To summarize, we analyze this impact of TBT on Chinese firms' trade margins and product quality. We consider various aspects of firm heterogeneity as well as a series of robustness checks. We focus on measures which are perceived as trade barriers by using the specific trade concerns database. Our key findings are threefold. We find a positive correlation between TBT imposition and exit. We also see that among the incumbents, they have larger sales and charge higher spot prices. And our most important results that we would like to emphasize on is the positive impact of TBTs on the product quality. So following the introduction of TBT, firms upgrade their product quality by expanding their research and development and importing more intermediate inputs and capital goods. And this positive impact of TBTs on quality upgrading is larger than the negative impact on price increase. So it results in lower quality adjusted prices, and this is interpreted as a good thing for the consumers. So for the policy implications, we show that TBT are not necessarily detrimental for firms' exports, but rather TBT could result in redistribution of market shares among surviving players. And from the exporting countries' perspective, supporting firms to improve compliance capacity could contribute to enhancing firms' competitiveness in the international market. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ha. That's great. It's a really interesting presentation, and we've got a couple of questions already in the Q&A. For anyone else, please feel free to put it in chat or in Q&A. I'm keeping track of it all. I've got my own questions as well. But let me hand over to Mahdi first for his discussion comments.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you very much, Ha. Actually, thank you very much, Hannah and Ben, for the invitation to be the discussant of this paper. Let me share my slides with you. So actually, it was a very interesting paper. I liked reading it, and well, the policy implication of such a paper is actually very important, as Hal mentioned. It's very important for a developing country or an emerging market like China, who joined the WTO in 2002, and then they actually observed new things in the global trading system. They observed non-tariff measures, because if you're not part of the WTO, it's difficult for you even to know how the regulations that are imposed on trade work. So I think it was a great effort for Chinese companies when they were exporting their products to other countries and destinations to get used to these new regulatory measures and comply with them. So that's super interesting, and China is a super interesting case. And I think the way that the databases are merged pushed you at the end to this period of analysis and to this set of variables, or let's say specific trade concerns to TBT. So let me discuss briefly the summary of the paper. actually the main research question of the paper is how does the restrictive TBT-STC, STC stands for specific trade concerns. And these are the STCs that are raised by China. So it means that the China or Chinese exporters feel that those TBTs that are imposed by other countries are trade restrictive. So specifically, these TBTs are chosen in this paper because there's a substantial reduction in the aggregate trade flows from China to those countries that are imposing them. So that's why it makes it more interesting. And the research question was how these TBT STCs affect trade margins, entry of firms, exit of firms, Chinese firms that are entering in that market that is imposing those regulations, and how it affects also the quality of exports from China during this period. So the quality, I saw in the Q&A session, I saw a question how quality is calculated. I read the paper. It's calculated similar to the, actually following the methodology by Khandelwal that says that if, for instance, given the price, holding the price constant, when the quality of a product is improved, then there is a higher market share for that given product. In other words, if we hold the quality of the prices, or if we hold the prices constant in the setting, it's like removing the price or the cost of the product from the value of trade, then what we will have is the quality. Or let's say the way that I saw it, it was volume of exports plus the price of exports that is estimated against some variables like fixed effects for the product in the destination, and also fixed effects for years and other things. So the residual will be the quality. So the higher it is, it means that the quality of the paper was so high that it induced higher demand in that destination. And because it is firm specific, it replicates the quality issue. But at the same time, I will have actually a concern which I will explain it in the next slide. But the data is coming from Chinese Customs Office, and it has the census data of firms that are exporting globally, and HS 4-digit products are selected because in the TBT STC database that is provided by the WTO, most of the products that are in those TBTs, they have 4-digit codes. There are also 6-digit codes, but majority of the products in this data has HS 4-digit. Actually, I used this database 10 years ago for my PhD studies, but at that time I didn't have any reliable firm level data that I could work with. So that's why I like this paper very much. I worked with the industry level trade statistics. And also it had tariff data from the WIIWs. And the methodology is using the OLS estimations on exports of Chinese firms against a dummy variable that indicates whether a STC is raised by China on a TBT that is imposed on a product by a trading partner. And control variables are tariffs, anti-dumping, and a set of high-dimensional fixed effects. But the dependent variables vary across models, market exit, as I explained, market entry, also export value, export price, export quality, and also quality adjusted prices. So I explain a bit here. So assume that a regulation is imposed in a country and an exporter needs to comply with that regulation. It means that, as Ha also explained, it should either improve its quality so that it can easily comply and manage to enter that market, or it can simply exit from that market. So in order to improve the quality, either it could be a variable cost or it could be a fixed cost. So there's a cost in it. So that cost, we can replicate that. We can call it as a quality adjusted price because the quality is already improved. So if we have a price of a commodity, some parts of that is showing us the quality, and some other parts of that is showing us the cost attached to it. Then as I explained, quality is estimated as a residual of the estimation of volume of exports, net of price against product and destination year fixed effects. So in other words, it's like saying that when we have value of exports and we estimate it against some fixed effects, then the residual of that is the quality, because we were playing with the coefficient of the price on the left-hand side of it. So it's actually the theory behind it. I refer you to Handelwald 2010, that you can read it and you can understand how the theoretical framework behind that is. And the good thing about the paper is that it is also instrumenting TBT, because TBTs could be endogenous. There could be reverse causality behind TBT. So a country imposes a TBT maybe as a protectionist measure to reduce the trade that is coming to that country in order to protect the domestic industry. So that's why maybe a surge in trade could affect introduction of new TBT. That's why it's necessary always to instrument TBTs in the analysis of trade flows. Then the findings would tell us that, well, actually there were many robustness checks and different samples, and given those different robustness checks, we observed that TBTs increase the probability of market exit of Chinese firms in many of the specifications. And actually, it's very interesting that they also increase the market entry for the specification that controls for the endogeneity bias. So it means that if we control for the reverse causality, TBTs could even introduce new markets to some companies in China, because they manage to fit in the regulations, they manage to understand what that market needs, and then they enter that market. And then, of course, export value is also increased in many of the specifications. Quality is also improved in many specifications, and quality adjusted price is decreased. So as I explained, the quality adjusted could be a cost factor here that is not good for consumers. It's neither good for producers as well. So if this cost is decreased, we can argue that in the whole economy, there's a welfare gain. So I have few comments and suggestions when I read through the text. So it is very standard to consider regulatory measures like TBT and SPS measures as standards or regulations. But we should be careful that standards, they are usually voluntary measures. So if a country imposes standards, it means that the exporter can or cannot apply that standard. But for regulations, it's a must, it's obligatory, so we should be careful in using both terms. Then TBT SDCs is a subsample of TBT, but of course TBT SDCs are the restrictive ones that raise concerns in the WTO committee meetings. It would be interesting to see if TBTs have also similar effect, at least a qualitative effect. And I think, so up to now, maybe there could be 30,000 TBT notifications in the WTO. But for TBT SDCs, I think it is around 5,000, 6,000 TBT SDC notifications. So TBTs are more abundant, but only SDCs are very restrictive. Then concerning the accumulated value of TBT SDC in the data that was used in the analysis. So sometimes TBT is implemented, and then after a period of time, that was also mentioned in the text, after a period of time, SDC is raised in the WTO committee meeting that says that the authorities complained that one TBT that was imposed by another country is restricting trade. So the reason of that trade restriction may not be necessarily behind the regulation itself. So it might not be the regulation itself that is restrictive. It could be some procedure at the border that makes that regulation restrictive. So when it becomes resolved, it means that the stringency or the wrong procedure at the border is resolved, but the regulation is still in force. So we are not sure that all of those TBT STCs that are resolved mean that the regulation is not in place anymore. So maybe it's good to have a specification in which we test the same model, but without removing the STC after it is being resolved. And then as far as I remember, the models were estimated using OLS. And so why not using, for instance, PPML for the export values that include also zero values? Because as you also showed, the number of observations in the exit and entry was much larger than the number of observations in the export value estimation. Or maybe when you're estimating the exit and entry, maybe you can use a probit and then take the inverse Mills ratio from that probit model and insert it in the OLS regression to at least have a kind of Heckman selection procedure. Or maybe for the estimation of zero values, you can use arc sign transformation that you could still hold the zero values there. It could apply also to other variables like tariffs using arc sign transformation. So this is the part that I was mentioning before that I would insert a comment. So in some studies, the sigma that is used as the coefficient of price in the estimation of quality is also estimated, because sigma could be product specific. So why not estimating it as some other papers in the literature did? Because if sigma is equal to 1, it means that the left-hand side is simply export value, because it is quantity plus sigma price, both in logs. So if sigma is equal to 1, it means that it is export value on the left-hand side. So it shouldn't be exactly equal to 1. And then in your paper, you used both HS 2-digit destination fixed effects and HS 4-digit destination fixed effects. I think the priority should go to HS 4-digit destination fixed effects, because otherwise, what if you have HS 2-digit destination fixed effects, what you observe is the variation of the effects within that 2 digits. So if a trading partner imposes one TBT on one 4-digit within that 2 digit, what you show is just a variation. But the interesting thing that you want to show is variation of the exporting for a specific firm over time. So within the same 4 digits. Then for the comparison between the magnitudes of tariff and TBT coefficients, it's difficult to interpret that because TBT STC in the analysis is a dummy variable. So why not maybe using count variables? Because you showed in your tables there is a variation in the number of TBT STCs. So maybe some of them are larger than 1, and then we can compare them with the tariff coefficient. Then for the market share, I read an interesting interpretation in the text, but I think it's better to interact the market share with the TBT variable to get to a better conclusion. Then the instrumental part, which I think is the most important part, and I believe that usually the part that controls for endogeneity bias should be considered as the benchmark. So this should go as the benchmark. And I saw 2 exogenous instruments. One was the TBT imposed by other partners. The other one was the TBT imposed by the same partner, but on other 4-digit products. So were there 2 TBT? Were there 2 exogenous instruments, or was it only 1? Then the interpretation of such a IV approach needs to be explained with cautious. So the fitted value in the second stage is actually the one that is induced by the exogenous instruments. So it means that if I am Chinese exporter and my export is affected by the fitted value of that, it means that I took all other factors out. So it means that if a TBT is imposed by Portugal, by the EU, that is induced by TBTs by other countries, then the exporter in China is more successful in exporting there, you know? The interpretation becomes a bit tricky. Then I like the firm heterogeneity results, but I saw them also in different samples. So maybe they could be done in the same sample of estimation, but interacting with the dummies that indicate the sample. So I mean, if I was a referee, I would have given these comments because I like it. But you know, as academics, we know that anytime you submit a paper to a journal, it gets out after referee revisions completely as a different paper. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mahdi. Those are great comments. And like you said, I feel like Haja's got a nice peer review sort of report there. So I know that'll be really useful to her and her co-author in revising the paper. We've just got a few minutes left. So what I'd actually like to do is step back a bit and just ask a kind of threshold understanding question that came up in the Q&A box. So I was wondering if you could just explain to us a little bit about how the STC process works at the WTO and, you know, why it might help us identify particular instances of TBTs that are problematic.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ben. So the first thing is I do not have a good cost estimate, but I believe this is the common perception that bringing the process to WTO would be more costly than solving bilaterally. For example, among ASEAN countries, they do have also the dispute settlement, but countries prefer to discuss bilaterally rather than bringing it to an official process. So once a country perceive an NTM as potentially harmful to the trade, then they would bring the issue to the WTO dispute settlement. One thing I would like to note here that what we observe from our database is that even though we only keep concerns raised by China, many of those concerns are actually jointly raised. So China may join at some point. Some concerns may already be there even before 2001 when China joined. But then because of the restrictiveness of these NTMs, there will be several countries who mutually raise these concerns. So it's not just China, but obviously in the database, we observe that we mainly observe very large trade partners that bring this issue to the WTO. So intuitively, we think that this is a more costly, could be time consuming, and also money in terms of monetary cost and time cost. So that's why we think it's more skewed toward large trade partners rather than small exporters. But unfortunately, I do not really have a good estimates. But that is what we get also the image and the experience from ASEAN's story.
Yeah, that makes sense. Maybe I can just add one thing. I mean, I think the question in the Q&A was sort of asking about the distinction between an STC and a dispute. So, you know, just to be clear, when you raise an STC through a notification at the WTO, what happens is that you then engage in consultations with the partner who's got the measure that you're concerned about. It may ultimately lead to a dispute, but mostly it doesn't. So I like Mahdi's sort of question/comment of kind of what do we do with the vast majority of these STCs that are actually resolved. So countries sit down and they talk about them, and usually they figure out some way of resolving it. So I think that's an interesting kind of additional question. Hannah, was there anything you wanted to add into the mix?
I just have a sort of a closing comment that this paper is so important because it points to something to policymakers that is so true, right? So we know that trade is important for development. But what we see that is absolutely true is that having these quality infrastructure parts, institutions that can help firms with standardization, regulation, and so on, accreditation. Using that as help in development is really what powers trade and does it for good. And I think that's a huge takeaway that I'm taking away. And I would love to see what Ha and Mahdi are saying, in terms of if you had a policymaker right in front of you, what is the biggest takeaway that you think that they should bring along?
Well, if I want to answer, well, first of all, regarding SDCs, as Ben also said, sometimes they lead to disputes. So we had an earlier paper, which was part of my PhD thesis 10 years ago, that we estimated the probability of disputes based on the probability of SDCs. So which disputes take place after the SDC is not resolved. And the probability was positive. So there is a serious statistical correlation between these SDCs and disputes. But the policy, the question that you asked, Hannah, is like, the answer to that question is also what Ha said in the very beginning, that Chinese exporters did manage to get use of these even restrictive trade policies, restrictive TBT measures, as soon as they understood how they could comply with them. So it's like a tariff jumping issue. There's a barrier there. There's a barrier that could be met. There are just certain rules and regulations that as long as you comply with them from point A to B to C to D, then you comply with them, then you manage to export with even higher quality. It means that because of that, you have higher demand, you have higher turnover, you have higher sale, and even you can reach some new destinations that are imposing these TBTs. So it's like at the end, the policymakers should inform their firms that they have support to comply with these regulations if they encounter them.
Do you have a last word? If there's a policymaker sitting in front of you, what do you say to them as the main takeaway from this research?
Well, I would emphasize the positive aspect of non-tariff measures of TBTs, because what we observe from the policy discussion is countries tend, when we talk about NTMs, countries always tend to shy away because they are worried that they may be exposed, that they may violate some rules, but we want to show them that they are there for a good reason. So let's try to be transparent, to focus on harmonization and cooperation, to simplify the procedure, to improve the design implementation process, rather than trying to discuss on how to eliminate them, which is still very popular perception that we see even these days.
Yeah, I think that's a really important takeaway. I'm going to add a couple of suggestions for people out there, because we always have people at the sort of PhD and early research stage. So my suggestion, if you're interested in TBTs, definitely read Ha's paper and read it next to a paper by Lionel Fontanier that does something quite similar using French data. And I think a really interesting contrast is between what we see going on in a middle-income country, namely in the Chinese data, and what we see going on in a high-income country like France. I think there are some really interesting contrasts there. Then I'll say something that I don't usually say, which is that there's a great qualitative literature on this kind of stuff as well. So the sort of heterogeneity that Ha was bringing out, there are some old World Bank reports. When I say old, they're like 10, 15 years old now, where people have done case studies where they show exactly the kind of shuffling mechanism that Ha is talking about in her paper, where you see that a new regulation in an import market leads some firms to exit, but then those firms that stay upgrade their quality and can even charge higher prices and send potentially more exports. So it's one of those areas that I think is an emerging area of consensus between different types of researchers. And like both our speakers said, it's vitally important for policy. So let me thank Ha and Mahdi for a really great session. Like I said at the beginning, I was really interested in this because it's an area that that I work on. I think there was tons of information in there for people who are either already working on this or thinking of getting into it. Now, let me just finish up by advertising our next session, which is on February 23rd. It's going to be a change of pace. So focusing on China again, but this time as an exporter and looking at the impact of Chinese imports. So for people who are familiar with the China shock literature that comes out of the US and also a number of high-income countries, we're lucky enough to have Marina Ngoma from Tufts, who's going to be presenting what is actually her job market paper on the way that looks in Ethiopia. And I don't want to spoil her results, but they're really fascinating results. And they taught me a lot of things that I didn't expect about the nature of the China shock in potentially in a range of low and middle income environments. So there's a ton of interesting information in there. If you're interested in trade policy in general or trade policy and labor market institutions and outcomes, this is the session for you. So please do join us on February 23rd at 9 a.m. And with that, thanks very much to everyone for attending. Thanks for all of your questions and comments. And of course, thanks again to Hannah, my co-host and co-founder, and to our two speakers for a really great session. And we'll see everyone back here in about a month's time.
Great session, everybody. And
Thank you
everything will be coming up on the website. So those who missed it, no FOMO needed. Thank you so very much for today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Ben, Hannah, and Mahdi. And thank you, all the participants. Thank you. Have a nice day.
You too.
You too. Bye.
Bye.